We start Chapter 3 with a general overview of the history of leadership theories. Chapter 3 is basically about presenting to you the wide range of theories and the evolution of the theories on leadership that have occurred since leadership was studied all the way back in the 1800s. And then we kind of leave you with, here's where the state of the theory development is today and what we really believe in. So let's start the timeline all the way back in the 1800s when the focus was on traits, which we call the trait era. And you can see it lasted a long time, almost maybe 140 years, something like that. What was going on with the trait era was that we believed in traits. This was the most powerful predictor of leadership behavior. What does that mean? We'll get into it in just a slide. Then when you go from the 40s to the 70s, the focus rather shifted to behaviors. Again, how does that differ from traits? We'll get to that in a second. And then finally, what we're in today is this thing called the contingency era, which is the most complex body of theories, but also the ones that we think best explain effective leadership. All of these theories, by the way, are there to try to explain what kind of leadership is going to be the most effective kind of leadership. Effective meaning things get done the right way and your followers are satisfied, basically, is the definition there. We start with the trait era, which again is the oldest development of leadership theory there is. It's what the field started with, and you see two columns here. This is the way we'll organize the next couple of slides. You've got assumptions about the era that were made about leaders and leadership, and then what the research actually found that looked into these assumptions. And for the first two eras, you're going to see that essentially the assumptions and the findings don't match. In other words, the findings tend to contradict the assumptions, and therefore there was a need to move on to the next phase of theoretical development, which would improve upon these research gaps, these deficiencies that didn't explain or correctly explain the body of knowledge that researchers were proposing. So anyway, with trait era, the main idea here again is that leaders have certain traits that make them leaders or effective leaders. So therefore, if you have those traits, you're going to be an effective leader. And the notion was that these traits are universal among leaders. So, whether it's the ability to get people to follow you or being perceived as being generous and kind. I'm not saying these are necessarily the traits, but what researchers did is they would theorize about what the traits were. Assertiveness would be another one, where they would say if you're assertive, you're a better leader. Well, it turns out that really none of that's true. Let me get into why in a second. Let me go bullet by bullet here. So, assumption one, leaders are born. Not true. Leaders can be made. You can be trained to be a leader. The research has shown that again and again. Is it easier to have the skills and then work them? Of course, but it's not that leaders can't be made. It's just that it probably takes a bit more work. But anybody can be a leader that winds up getting the right skill set and uses it in the right way. We'll talk about that later. Leaders have special characteristics and traits. Again, not true. Bullet point 2 there, and 1 and 2, excuse me, on the finding side. No single trait or traits clearly defines leaders, or we should say effective leaders, and traits actually play a minimal role. Okay, so whatever that thing is that you are, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to wind up being a good leader. And some of these are surprising. Things like assertiveness, things like being aggressive, things like being liked. You would think these would automatically lead to effective leadership. Not true, is what the research is finding. How do we explain this, and what's the better explanation? Coming right up in a few slides. Assumption 3, leaders and followers have different traits. Sometimes they have the same traits, sometimes they're different. That one is kind of inconclusive. But I think the most important bullet point there that summarizes the whole problem with the trait era and the trait notion of leadership is that traits are not and never will be the dominant factor in leadership. They are just a small piece of the puzzle that helps define what effective leadership is going to look like. So the second era is the behavior or behavioral era, and the focus here, as the logic or the name would imply, is that behaviors drive effective leadership. Now, how is behavior, first of all, different from traits? Let's get that out here and defined and differentiated. So traits are things or aspects about you that don't change for the most part, no matter what environment you're in. So if you're always if you're generous and kind in one setting, you'll probably be generous and kind in another setting. If you are assertive and aggressive in one setting, you'll probably be assertive and aggressive in other settings. And so therefore those are traits that we're talking about because they're unchanging. Behaviors can and do change. Are they a function of traits? Yes, of course they are, because traits are what make up your personality, and personality, of course, drives your behavior, among other things. There are other things like situations and environment that drive your behavior as well. So the focus of this era was, let's forget about the idea, or at least put to the side the idea that traits determine effective leadership, and now it's all about how you act based on those traits and based on other kinds of things, but the behavioral choices you make, which we essentially can observe. That's the bullet point 2 there on the left. Traits are not always measurable, but they are more measurable than they used to be. Behaviors are directly measurable because we see what you do. Or we should say, not always measurable, definitely observable. We can always observe. Sometimes we can measure behavior. Can behavior be taught? Yes. Can traits be taught? Not quite as much, because traits are things that are acquired over time and they're hard to get rid of. They're they're thought of as being permanent, and that's what makes up your personality. So the whole idea of this era of leadership theory development was that behaviors are more important than traits in determining whether the leader is going to be effective. Okay, so how you behave as a leader matters more than what your personality is. So what are the findings? The findings are, yes, well, this body of theory worked better than traits, or the trait era theories, but it still was vastly incomplete in describing when a leader would be or wouldn't be effective. Okay, so that's your bullet point 2 there on the right. Behaviors alone do not determine effective leadership. They are an input. They are certainly an input, and how could they not be? I mean, that's just kind of obvious that the way a leader behaves would determine his or her effectiveness. But look at bullet point 3 there on the right. No clear findings as to which behaviors are most effective. So this whole idea of the universality of traits, first of all, went out the window. And now we're saying there's no universality of effective behaviors. That goes out the window because certain behaviors work well in certain situations and not so well in other situations. So it's not quite the behavior that dictates whether a leader will be effective. Okay. Now the third thing that came out of this era is probably the most important advance that gets used still, is your first bullet point there on the right. Key behaviors are split up into 2 arenas. One is the task structuring arena, the other is the relationships consideration arena. Let me define that briefly. We're going to come back to that idea again and again and again, and we saw it last time with the LPC scale when we talked about least preferred coworker. LPC stands for least preferred coworker. We talked about task or relationship orientation and how in the contingency model put out by Fiedler, depending on which kind of leader you are, you'll wind up doing better depending on how much situation control you have. So anyway, the major advance here was actually coming up with the precursor to that model, which is that there's task and structure kinds of people, and there's relationship and consideration kinds of people leaders. And they're complementary skills, and at the same time very different skills that are needed in leadership and they do different things. If you're structuring, you're literally putting together a roadmap of how people should accomplish something, being specific about building, I hate to use the word in the definition, but building a structure, okay, for people to work within. Whereas relationships and consideration is more about, hi, how you doing? Everything going okay? Can I help? Can I be an emotional supporter of you? That kind of mentality and that kind of behavior. It's really more about emotional support through the formation of relationships rather than putting together a roadmap, blueprint, architecting a set of processes. So again, this era was weak because it didn't explain every outcome of behavior that researchers want. I'm sorry, every outcome of leadership that researchers wanted to explain. So then we come to the final phase, which is the contingency model in the next slide. So here you have a bit more of an organized list of the differences between task-oriented behaviors and relationships or consideration-oriented behaviors, which just picks up on the stuff we were talking about in the last slide. So, if you're a task-oriented leader, you're doing a lot of goal setting, you're clarifying your followers' expectations, you're putting together schedules and timelines and blueprints and that kind of thing, and doing a lot of assignment of tasks, which otherwise could be called delegation, but it's not always actually delegation. On the relationships or consideration side, again, it's more about emotional support, showing empathy, understanding, being your follower's friend, or at least professional friend. There is a difference. Allowing for their participation and input. We'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of that later. And then just this whole idea of nurturing your followers, I think nicely sums up the idea of relationship building and consideration behaviors. So now remember again that the behavioral theories as well as the trait theories of effective leadership were flawed because they didn't explain why leaders would do well or not do well in certain situations. And so therefore the conclusion was that these behaviors and these traits, behavior being a more flexible form of trait, were not actually good predictors and insufficient models for, again, the predicting and explaining leadership effectiveness. Okay, so along comes the final era, or maybe at least the one that everybody's believing in now. It could be supplanted by something else, though it's not likely in the future, which we call the contingency era. The contingency era, the word contingency means it depends, right? It depends on something. So what depends on what? Well, the most effective leadership style depends on something. And so we're going to get into that something right here and now. The first idea is there is no one best way to lead. That is what contingency stands for and means. As I mentioned, traits and behaviors don't always explain or predict who's going to be an effective leader. What you need to do, and this is the something that I keep referring to, is you have to understand the personality and behavior of the leader as well as the situation in which he or she finds himself. Let me say that again because it's crucial. If you want to predict and explain effective leadership, you have to know about the leader's traits and behaviors, and you have to know about what situation he or she finds him or herself in. Once you have all those pieces of the puzzle, you can predict whether a leader is going to be successful, whether he or she is going to be effective. Okay, and the key missing link here was situation. Situation, which is environment and kind of what's going on in the environment, dictates when the traits and the behaviors are appropriate or inappropriate. And so all the models we're going to look at going forward in this module here are going to be contingency kinds of models that try to match traits and behaviors with the appropriate situations, or put better, try to match the situation with which traits and behaviors are really going to make for an effective leadership scenario. Okay, so the last bullet point there I think wraps it up also nicely. personal and situational factors. The personal is traits and behaviors. The situational factors are what's going on in the environment. Both of these combine to affect leadership effectiveness. So in this module, we're going to look at 4 contingency models of leadership effectiveness. And let me reiterate that again, these models all try to predict and explain when leaders are going to be effective and when they're not going to be effective. And so they're going to marry the analysis of the traits and behaviors of the leader with an analysis of the situation in which they find themselves and see when there is an effective match versus an ineffective match. So our first model is the oldest, which is also still used. I like this model. It's interesting. Fiedler's contingency model. Okay, and so Fiedler says in bullet point 1 there, leadership effectiveness is a function of the match between the leader's style and the leadership situation. So that's nothing new. We already knew that all contingency models look for that match. Now here is, I think, the most crucial piece of this model to key in on, is bullet point 2. It's basically saying the leader can't change or change easily his or her leadership style. Okay, it's kind of like the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, Fiedler believed that about leaders. He said that leaders, once they develop a style, which is an outgrowth of their personality, then that is an unchangeable force. Okay, it's basically a trait. And remember, traits were permanent qualities that people have. Okay, so Fiedler doesn't believe you can change your behaviors and your personality. So therefore, if you want to be effective, you need to match your personality with the right situation, which means that because you can't change your own personality, your own traits, the only thing left to change is the situation. And you should make the situation fit your leadership style. Now, we all know that that can sometimes be darn near impossible. You're going to change an organizational culture overnight? I don't think so, most of the time. You can try, and leaders do try, and sometimes they succeed, but that's a really tough thing to do. Really, what he's saying in this model is, well, there are certain leaders that are going to work in certain situations and certain leaders who aren't going to work in certain situations. So you're probably better off changing the leader before you are better off changing the situation, because it's easier to change a leader, meaning just hire somebody new and get rid of the old person, than it is to change a culture and a situation and environment. A lot of times it's just not changeable because it's beyond your boundaries of control. But that's the key assumption in this model is leaders basically cannot change their styles, and so therefore you may want to think about changing leaders. But if you can change the situation, and again, it's not impossible, it's just harder to do, then you think about changing the situation to suit the leader's style. The beautiful thing about all these contingency models is that they have very specific structures to them. They really basically reduce themselves down to charts and tables that will tell you when the leader will or will not be effective. What are the circumstances in which there's going to be success in leadership? And so in order to do that, we have to break down our definitions scientifically and understand what all the parameters are that make these predictions. And so for Fiedler's contingency model, it's leader style and situational control, which again harkens back to that idea of tell me about the leader's traits and behaviors, and then tell me about the situation in which he or she finds him or herself. Okay, so we're going to talk now about leader style and situational control, define those pretty tightly, and then use those as parameters in the model. So here we go. Leader style is either going to be task or relationship oriented. Okay, and how do we measure that? Well, you already did that, or you're doing that when you fill out the LPC scale, okay, which tells you whether you're task oriented or relationship oriented or somewhere in between. In which case, it's really up to you and maybe others to determine which you really are, or maybe you're a little bit of both, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, so I'll get into the further definition of that in the next slide. We've got a beautiful little slide that talks about how task-oriented people act and how relationship-oriented people act. But you already have a good idea. We've danced around this issue several times now. Then there's the matter of situational control, which is exactly what it sounds like. How much control do you as a leader have over the situation that's unfolding? And we have to leave the word situation kind of vague because there are, an infinite number of situations that can occur in an organizational environment. But basically, there are three parameters that can always summarize any situation that any leader is facing, and they are leader-member relations, task structure, and position power. Let's go through each of those in turn. And they're fairly simple concepts, but not always so simple to measure. That's the issue. Leader-member relations is exactly what it sounds like. How well does a leader get along with his or her subordinates? Sometimes it's a matter of time. If the leader is new, the LMR won't be so good just because time hasn't allowed it to be that good. Sometimes time works against you. There are leaders who might do well for a while, then they do something wrong. They get their employees, subordinates mad at them for whatever reason because they made some kind of a change, or they're leading differently than they used to, and so therefore the leader-member relations have degraded. But anyway, what it requires is an assessment of that relationship. Task structure talks about how well defined the jobs and tasks within an organization are. So if you have a high task structure, then everybody pretty much knows what they need to do along every step of the way. Okay. A simple rule of thumb here, of course, is the longer an organization has been doing something, the more structured that task is likely to be, because you can iron out the bugs, you can practice it, you can rehearse it, you can just know what you need to do through repetition and learning. So the task structure increases over time. There are plenty of jobs and tasks and projects out there that have very little task structure because they're new, because the environment in which they're performed keeps changing. Tumultuous environments where funding might get cut, makes you reformulate how you do something because now you've got less money. So there are lots of examples of jobs and tasks with very little structure. The issue here for this model is determining whether there's high or low task structure. The last piece there under SITCON, by the way, SITCON is a quick abbreviation for situation control. It sounds like a war room tactic here, but it's really just meant to be a quick way to say situation control, okay, because that can take a while. But anyway, position power is your last piece there, and position power just literally talks about how much power the leader has, either because it's been given to him or her formally, or because he or she can assume that power based on his or her relationship with the followers and the subordinates. Now that sounds a little bit like the leader-member relations, but the two don't always correlate. That is to say, you could have a lot of power and not really be liked by your subordinates. Just think of a lot of these autocratic societies where that's the case. Saddam Hussein, okay, had a lot of position power until we got him, but terrible for the most part leader-member relations. Okay, so these are different things. One talks about how well the two parties are getting along. That's LMR. The other talks about literally how much power do they have, either because the followers gave it to them or because somebody else gave it to them and now they can use it with their followers. So it's time now to explain in further detail the differences between task-oriented and relationship-oriented kinds of people and leaders. So let's just remind ourselves here, how do we figure out what we are, whether we're task-motivated or relationship-motivated? Well, the scientific way to do it is to take the least preferred coworker scale and generate a score on that scale, and then figure out which category you belong in based on that score, which is exactly what you all have been doing for this week's self-assessment exercises. So what then is the difference between task-motivated and relationship-motivated people? Well, with task-motivated people, it's all about the task. They want to get the job done. They're not there to necessarily form relationships, although that happens kind of as a side byproduct. The task-motivated leader really just cares about getting the task done and getting it done right. So, it says focus on the task first. Task-motivated leaders, if the followers or the people assigned to the task are incompetent, they're going to get angry probably a lot of the time at the incompetence, and they're going to themselves get frustrated and probably frustrate some of their colleagues. So competence really matters for the task-motivated leader, much more so than it does for the relationship-motivated leader. And task-oriented people like details. They like structure. They like plans, action plans, and blueprints and that kind of thing, because it helps them accomplish the task. It provides an inborn structure to the task, whereas relationship people don't care quite as much about structures and relationships as far as the parts of the task go. So that's task-motivated people. Relationship-motivated people, again, the opposite end of the spectrum. They really care about forming and maintaining relationships and their bonds with people. So, whereas the task people feel good when they've accomplished a task, the relationship-oriented people feel good when they form those relationships with others, whether or not the task gets done. That's the thing about relationship-motivated. It's really more about nurturing those relationships and maintaining those bonds than getting the job done, which doesn't always lead to great results, but sometimes it's actually the thing that you need. So focus on people first, pleasing others, whether it's taking them out to lunch, whether it is saying the right thing at the right time, whether it is showing consideration for something difficult that they're going through. There's lots of ways to do this, of course, but the task-oriented leader doesn't really care about doing that. They care about getting the task done and then rewarding for getting the task done, which is, of course, another way to please people, but not usually necessarily even the best way, because people just expect that anyway. You're going to get paid for doing your job. Now, loyalty, very important to relationship-motivated people. Okay, because again, they're not there to find necessarily the best person for the job. They're there to find somebody who's going to stick with them for a while and whom they can give work over the long run to do, because they trust them and they trust that they're going to have the organization's best interest at heart. Whereas the task-motivated person, if it was up to them, they would just choose the best person for the particular task and not worry about long-term relationship building and long-term they don't take a long-term horizon planning perspective like relationship people do as far as forming friends in the organization. Okay, and then lastly, task-motivated people love details. Relationship people hate them. They get bored with them. A perfect example was Ronald Reagan as president. He was a relationship president. So was Clinton. Then we talk about the Bushes, probably more on the task side. Although I haven't seen formal research that says that. This is just kind of conjecture. But Reagan, the big thing with him was he didn't really know what was going on in his cabinet. And so, he would have the vision and he could communicate the vision, and people loved to hear him speak. But if you asked him about details, he wouldn't know what to tell you, especially when it came to the scandal he was involved in. But that's a whole other matter. But the point is, you can do very well not knowing a lot of details, because you have other people who work on that, and so therefore you focus on the relationship end of things while your subordinates focus on the details. So what seems like a very confusing diagram here is actually a neat little way to predict or have Fiedler's contingency model predict whether you're going to get effective leadership outcomes or not. So it ties together all of the variables that we've been discussing. And let's just quickly review Fiedler's model so that we understand the framework for this diagram. Fiedler says again that two independent variables, namely situational control and the task versus relationship orientation of the leader, when you marry those two and match those two against each other, they're going to determine how well the group performs, which is the proxy for leadership effectiveness. That is to say, the more effective the leader, the better the group performance. So that's what you're seeing here in this diagram, is tying together all of those ideas. And let's go ahead and do an example or two to show you how to actually use the chart. The first thing you do is you try to figure out what kind of situational control you have. So you go to the bottom of the diagram and you look at all these white boxes, and you start with the leader-member relations row, where you've either got a good LMR or a bad LMR. Let's say for now that we have a good LMR, good leader-member relations. The leader is getting along well with his or her subordinates, so we're going to call that good. Where do you draw the line? It's very subjective. That's one of the flaws of the model, but it might as well be called the flaw of every model. There's always some level of subjectivity that you have to apply. But typically if you ask people, they'll tell you, yes, the relationship is good, or no, it's not so good. So you can land on one of those two squares, or rectangles rather, pretty easily. Okay, then we say we look at rather task structure, and we either say it's high or low. So let's say we're dealing with a very structured task. So we're going to call task structure high in this case. Everything is laid out beautifully. There are maps and diagrams and blueprints and so on and so forth, processes that have been done for a long, long time. So we have a high task structure. So now we're, again, good LMR, high task structure, and we have to choose, finally, a position power. So it's either high or low, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that again the leader has a high position power because he or she is high up in the organization, or he or she has just accumulated a lot of power through his or her tenure with the organization, and so therefore you're basically all the way at the left. Remember, again, good LMR brings you to the left half side of the task structure, which we chose high for. And then under the high task structure was high position power, so you're basically all the way to the left of the horizontal space. And then you go up to the diagram and you have to choose whether you're a low LPC or a high LPC. Let's redefine that for you and remind you that low LPC means you are task oriented, and high LPC means you are relationship oriented. So again, if you're in an environment that has good LMR, high task structure, high position power, you right away notice that the green bar in that area is much, much higher than the dotted red bar in that area. So that's to say that the low LPC leader is going to extract a much, much better group performance than the high LPC leader in this particular situational control environment where you have good LMR, high task structure, high position power. So what does that mean? The task-oriented leader is going to do much, much better. Okay, whereas the relationship-oriented leader is going to flounder a bit, or a lot, I should say, because look at the gap in the measurements there. Conversely, if you go to the right side of the diagram, first thing you notice is that both the green and the red are always lower. Okay, what's going on there is you're moving from high to low situational control. So anytime you lose situational control, you can always expect anybody's performance as a leader to go down. Except that, in certain situations, let's say that you have bad LMR, high task structure, and let's say low position power, it turns out that the two leaders will probably do about equally. But if you just change things a little bit and you say bad leader-member relations, high task structure, and high position power, then your high LPC bar is much higher than your low LPC bar. So that is to say that your relationship-oriented leader winds up being much, much more effective. okay, in that particular situational control environment. So that is the neat thing about these diagrams, is that they can really literally pinpoint who's going to do better in which situations. And you do see the lines cross, so there are some kind of moderate situational control environments where the two leaders were indifferent between them as far as group performance goes. They're going to do just about the same, okay? But again, the other trend that we noticed is as you go from high to low situational control, performance tends to degrade, no matter who you are as a leader. And then depending on how the permutations work with the LMR, the task structure, and the position power, and then again who we're dealing with as a leader. Is it a high LPC or a low LPC leader? Which again, Fiedler is saying you can't change. You're one or the other as a leader. You're not going to one day be high LPC and the next day be low LPC. One day you're relationship oriented, the next day you're task oriented, unless you fall right in the middle of the scale, which again is kind of unusual. So therefore, you are what you are, and that dictates what kind of performances you're going to be able to extract from your followers, your group, based on the situational control. So again, don't worry if you don't get this diagram at first pass. It takes a little bit of studying, but it's a great little way to get yourself to the right answer as far as the Fiedler's contingency model is concerned. Some takeaways on Fiedler's contingency model. First of all, as a leader, you need to know whether you're more task-oriented or more relationship-oriented, or whether you're somewhere in between, because that is going to dictate which situations you will perform effectively in. Okay, so how do I figure that out? You take the LPC scale, or I guess more informally, people can tell you whether they think you're task-oriented or relationship-oriented if they understand the concept. Bullet point 2, leaders should focus on changing their situation to match their style rather than trying to change their style. Okay, because again, this model tends to believe that leaders essentially can't change their personas, their personalities, their behaviors, and of course traits are never changeable. So what do? You either change the situation, which is again hard to do, and that involves change leadership and culture management and that kind of thing. We'll get into that later in the course. Or you just put another leader in there whose personality and behaviors do match the situation that the leader finds him or herself in. Okay, but you don't really try to get the leader to change their style, because that's not practical, and in a lot of cases not really possible. Bullet point 3, I think, is pretty standard throughout any model, but it's worth repeating here because it's one of the tenets of the model. A good relationship with followers is key. That's something that, again, is built over time. It's very hard to change. If you have a good relationship, believe it or not, it can be difficult to attack that. If you've built up that well of goodwill and good relationships over time, that's not something that's going to dissolve very easily, even if there's a situation that happens that is contrary to the good relationship that you've built. But LMR helps you get better situation control, according to Fiedler. And the last thing is, the task structure is one of the most changeable elements of the Fiedler model. That is to say, you can't really change your leader-member relationships that easily, but you can change the task structure by having somebody come in and structure it more, or maybe you as the leader structure it more, or you have a consultant who comes in and structures the task more. There's a lot of ways to build in task structure. The bullet point here says seek training. That's just one of many methods a leader can use to heighten the task structure, if that's what you need to do. Sometimes you wouldn't want to do that because it doesn't make sense, because things are changing so rapidly and so frequently that a task structure will hinder you more than help you. So anyway, the point is that's a movable point on the model, whereas LMR and then the power piece it tends to be less movable or less changeable in the short run. So now we move on to the next model of leadership effectiveness, called the normative decision model. And this one is different from Fiedler's contingency model in that it assumes from the outset that leaders can change their decision styles. With Fiedler, we said leaders are either task or relationship oriented or somewhere in between, but you kind of stay there as a leader and you don't have the leeway to choose your style. Whereas normative says there are choices leaders can make when they decide how to lead. And so therefore, the best leaders will make the right choices in the appropriate situations to generate the best kind of leadership needed in that situation. So again, it's contingency model because it's situationally driven. That's what contingency means. But again, it matches a leader's skills, which can, in this particular model, change. They are a movable part, so to speak. Okay, so bullet point 1, leaders are effective when they use decision styles that match the situation. That's the same as Fiedler's model. But now we differ in bullet point 2, where leaders can learn to change and use different decision styles. And then 3, of course, we always have to understand the leadership situation that we find ourselves in. It is crucial to any model. So there are 2 main independent variables that the normative decision model uses to suggest a leadership style. The kinds of styles that can be employed fall into 3 different kinds of categories. Let's go over those first. That's your first bullet point. So the leader's decision style can be autocratic, it can be consultative, it can be a group delegation task. So let's define and differentiate quickly here for you. Autocratic means the leader doesn't take into consideration anything that the followers are saying or thinking. The leader just relies on him or herself and his or her information to make a decision unilaterally. Okay, that's the one that you probably already know. Consultative, on the other hand, means that the leader is still making the decision, but is relying on typically his followers to provide input for the decision. Okay, so in other words, he or she consults with his or her followers, gathers information, and then makes a decision, but it's still a unilateral decision, meaning you're not asking your followers, what should I choose, and then having them actually choose with you. That's the third point, where the group makes a decision. So you say to the followers, okay, here's option A, here's option B, let's take a vote. What do you all think? And then we go with whatever the group decides. Or sometimes the leader doesn't want to hand in the decision at all, so he or she delegates it to his or her followers. So we have a decision, I don't want to be involved in it, it totally affects you, I don't care either way what the outcome is, and I want you to own it, so I'm going to delegate the decision-making task to you, my followers, and then they make the decision, and the leader lives with the consequences of that decision, whatever it is. Okay, so 3 different modes of decision style, which are going to be appropriate in different kinds of leadership situations. The situations are generally parameterized by the 2 factors you see at the bottom there. The importance of the quality of the decision and the acceptance of the decision by subordinates. So are we talking about a really important kind of decision, or one that's a little bit more trivial, maybe, is the word to use there? Okay, and lots of decisions get made in organizations every day, and some are more important than others. Some hold a lot in the balance, jobs, progress, project progress, that kind of thing. Others are, what color should we paint the wall, white or gray, which is important, but not quite as important as say, other things. The other parameter is how likely is the decision to be accepted by subordinates if the leader makes it unilaterally. Okay, so we're actually going to break out those 2 major contingency factors into something like 7 or 8 more specific ones. That's your next slide. So here are your individual factors in the normative decision model. I'm actually going to read right out of the textbook here because I think the text does a great job of very succinctly stating the question that relates to the factor in the normative decision model. So let's start with the quality requirement. The text says, how important is the quality of the decision? So if it's very important, that would be high. Okay, it's either going to be a high, low, or a yes or no, are the way we kind of answer these questions. Commitment requirement asks, how important is employee commitment to the implementation of the decision? So if you can get away with not having employees commit to it, yet still carry on the task, then the commitment requirement is low. If you need the employee's commitment to carry on with the task, then it's high. And don't assume that everything needs employee commitment. There are some things leaders can just do and not have to worry about what followers or employees think. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that's always a great idea. I'm saying that, again, in the mix of decisions, there are some that tend to fall into that category. Leader information. Does the leader have enough information to make a high-quality decision? So that's a yes or a no. Either he does or he doesn't, or she does or she doesn't. Okay. And the assumption there is saying, does the leader have enough information without the help of subordinates or followers to make the decision? So either yes or no. Structure of the problem. Is the problem clear and well structured? We talked about this issue in the task structure category for Fiedler's model. Okay, so your choices were over there were high versus low. Now it's going to be your yes or no. Is there structure to the problem or not? Is it clear and well structured or not? So it's kind of the same thing. Commitment probability. How likely is employee commitment to the solution if the leader makes the decision alone? Okay, so that's exactly what it sounds like. Will employees commit because they like the leader, because the decision is likely to just garner employee commitment either way you choose, because it's either irrelevant to their welfare or so tangential that it doesn't matter? There's a whole host of reasons why that can happen. So, this again is going to be I believe it's a yes or no kind of an answer in the model. Goal congruence. Do employees agree with and support organizational goals? So this has nothing to do with the actual decision you're making. It's talking about, generally speaking, do employees tend to support what the organization is doing? And that can change over time, can change with changes in the culture, but you have to get an assessment of whether employees generally support organizational goals. And that's a yes or a no answer. Employee conflict. Is there conflict among employees over a solution for this particular decision? So now we're getting back to the specific decision at hand. And so it might be that employees have no idea what's going on with this particular matter. It might be that they know everything there is to know. They know all the sides and there is conflict, or there isn't conflict. Or maybe it's somewhere in between where some employees know, some don't. And some have opinions and some don't. And so it's kind of a moderated case of conflict, or tempered case. So again, this is a yes or a no kind of an answer. And this is one where it can be hard to give a simple yes or no. As with other pieces of the model, it might be hard to say high or low or yes or no. And that is admittedly a weakness of the model, but you still try to use it as best you can. The last one, subordinate information. Do employees have enough information to make a high-quality decision? Again, that is to say without the leader. Okay, so again, a yes or a no is what the model needs here. Now, once you have all these yeses or nos, the model will tell you what kind of decision-making style is most appropriate. And if you go to page, I'm going to say 73 for edition 3. If we're working with a later edition, it'll be somewhere near page 73 probably. The book will tell you which decision style is best for that particular chain of events, meaning how we answered all of these, 8 bullet points here for factors in the normative decision model. So you have decision styles like unassisted decision. You have ones like ask for specific information but make decisions alone. These are all manifestations of the decision style that we talked about on the prior slide. And there's another 8 of them. I'm sorry, there's 8 total of those. The other end of the extreme here is the DI, which is other person analyzes the problem and makes the decision. So the leader doesn't actually even analyze the facts or make the decision at all, which is the exact opposite of doing an unassisted decision, which they abbreviate AI as opposed to DI. So anyway, you can consult your text to see the details, but I just want to lay out the general framework for the normative decision model. It's a really complex pathway towards decision making, and that's why a lot of leaders don't want to use it. I don't think it's really that complex, honestly. If you can move your finger along a couple of lines and make some decisions about these factors here, then it's actually pretty easy to use. The hard part, of course, is knowing how to answer all of these 8 bullet points here. Do we have QR? Do we have CR? Is it high or low? Is it a yes or a no? Those tend to be gray areas. So the model is weak on that score. So now wrapping up the normative decision model, a couple of things to leave with you, some of which you've already heard, and so we'll reinforce here. 1, you have to understand your leadership situation, which is, again, those 8 factors on the last slide. You have to be able to answer high, low, yes or no. Number 2, you as a leader have to learn different decision styles. If you agree that this is the way to lead, this model makes sense, and I think more researchers believe in this model than they do the Fiedler model, then you agree that leaders can and will, the effective leaders that is, can and will learn different decision styles and employ them in the right kinds of situations where they're called for. So literally as a leader, you can go to this chart on page 73 or thereabout and pick a leadership decision style and execute it based on where you think the organization is. That's the great thing about this model. Point 3 is, I think, the most interesting one. Participation is not always desirable. This model tends to believe that group work and group decision-making and meetings are time wasters and that they create conflict as opposed to eliminating or mitigating it. And so therefore, the model would always try to lean towards having the leader make decisions with less help from followers rather than more help. So, it's an interesting viewpoint, and it's a little bit actually oldish, meaning the world has kind of moved in the opposite direction, where everything nowadays is empowerment and group decision-making. But it's something that I think, in certain situations holds true. It really does hold true that the more people you involve, the more you complicate the decision. And so therefore, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes participation hurts you more than it helps you. Last bullet point, leaders have to pay attention to their followers' needs and reactions when making decisions. Kind of obvious, but it's one of the underlying tenets of the model. We now move on to the path-goal theory, which is maybe a simpler theory than the ones that we've seen before and a little bit more general. The focus of this theory is really on obstacles. If you had to pick one keyword to sum it all up, it's a focus on how leaders should deal with obstacles, or better said, removing obstacles that stand in followers' ways from completing their tasks. So there's your first bullet point. The model assumes that the leader is there to basically remove obstacles. Now, how you remove those obstacles is what the model is going to tell you. Okay, sometimes it's going to be one way of removing it, sometimes it's going to be another way of removing it. That's the key. Like the last model we looked at, the normative decision model, this model assumes that the leader can and should change his or her behaviors to suit the situation, which here is really driven by subordinates' needs for removing those obstacles. So this is a nice slide that I think summarizes all the aspects of the path-goal theory. And by the way, if you don't have all the pieces here, keep clicking until they appear. I had to do that myself. What happens is at first you just see the one in the middle, and then you keep clicking and the ones on the graphics on the side appear. So let's talk about each of the pieces. Let's start from left to right. Upper left corner, that orange arrow, it's kind of pointing to the bottom right. It says leader structuring and consideration. These are the two leader behaviors that this particular theory considers important. So we already know what structuring and consideration is. Another word for that is task structure and relationship orientation. the model is saying that leaders need to provide one or the other kinds of leadership depending on what situation they find themselves in, related to their subordinates and their followers. So then we look at the situational contingencies, and this is saying, okay, situations are different. Some situations require task structure because there is none, and it's needed, and it's called for. Then the other situational contingency that may occur is that the employee or the follower needs or does not need autonomy, meaning they want to do things themselves. They want to learn themselves. They want to practice themselves. They even want to sometimes, or most of the time, self-evaluate. So depending on which contingencies are present, that is going to dictate what the leader needs to give the follower. So if the follower needs task structure, you give them task structure, what we call structuring. If the follower needs autonomy because that's what's going to make them do a better job, then you give them autonomy. If they don't want autonomy, you don't give it to them. So it's a pretty simple logic that's in effect here with path goal. And those are your obstacles: the lack of task structure, or the lack of autonomy that the employee needs to do their job well. And so you are sometimes removing those obstacles because they are obstacles, or sometimes you're putting them in place, and then we wouldn't call them obstacles, but they are needs for the given situation. So you have to be, as a leader, comfortable with both task and consideration kinds of leadership. Okay, now I'm moving on to the middle here of the diagram. And understand what your followers need and how they're perceiving the situation. Are they perceiving they need more task orientation? Are they perceiving that they need more autonomy? And so if you're doing a good job of matching, path goal theory says, like all the other models say, you'll have effective leadership. And the way effective leadership gets measured here is through employee satisfaction and motivation. The rightmost star graphic there. Now notice this is a little bit of a different dependent variable than the ones that we've looked at before. With Fiedler's model, the dependent variable, or the proxy for effective leadership, was group performance. Okay. With normative decision model, there really was no variable other than to say general leadership effectiveness. It pointed us in the way of looking at what was the right kind of decision mode for the given situation. But here it shifts a little bit from the Fiedler model, and we're not looking necessarily at group performance. We're looking at employee satisfaction and motivation. Now, does that, of course, have an effect on group performance? Of course it does. Satisfaction and motivation is intimately tied to, of course, group performance. But it's still a different measure. And so you need to understand that these different theories will sometimes have different measures as their dependent variables. The independent variables are always different, and that's the beauty of the set of models taken together. They complement each other and talk about different aspects of leadership and when they're not, when they are and when they're not important or necessary. So I just want to point that out with path goal. So some thoughts to leave you with on path goal theory. First of all, what's crucial is that you understand where your subordinates are coming from. Okay, so that's your first bullet point. You must understand your followers' perception of the task. Do they find it challenging? Do they find it boring, routine, repetitive, annoying? Let's face it, a lot of things we have to do at work are not that pleasant. Although we hope to maximize the pleasant to unpleasant quotient, right? But anyway, we have to understand how the subordinate perceives the task. Number two, take our followers' need for challenge and autonomy into consideration. So if we sense that our followers need a challenge and want a challenge, then we give them a challenge. And that typically means that we're less directive. That's our third bullet point here, but I'm getting into it now. Directive means that you literally tell your follower what to do. Do step 1, then step 2, then step 3. In this sequence and in this way, and so you're building structure into the task, basically. Directive and task structure are almost synonymous. Then the other piece is autonomy. If the follower or the subordinate wants to be or have autonomy, meaning they don't want your help, they want to do it themselves or kind of form their own team or context to solve the problem, then you let them do it, if it makes sense. Bullet point 4, when the task is routine, boring, stressful, that's when you have to switch into supportive mode or relationship mode, what we call consideration in the path goal theory. And we've talked about the elements of that before. 2 models left to discuss in this unit. The first is the substitute for leadership model, or SLM for short. The idea here is that sometimes you don't actually need leadership, or put another way, leadership is provided by someone other than the leader or leaders. So we're going to talk about situations where you can have substitutes for the typical leader, and also situations where leadership practices get neutralized, which is a word that means compromised, basically. So in other words, leader tries to do X but cannot do X because there's something that's effectively counteracting his or her leadership practice. So we're going to go through all the situations where you can have substitutes and neutralizers for leadership. And typically, remember, substitutes are good things. Neutralizers tend to be bad things, or at least not as good as the substitutes. You don't want to neutralize a leader's power unless you don't want the leader to have power. But for the time being, we'll assume that the leader is doing the right thing and should have the power to do what they want to do. So the other thing to remember is, the reason why we tell you all these substitutes and neutralizers is so that you can be aware of them. What are some situations in which I can stop leading so much and spend my time being more strategic and maybe doing more networking? So what you want to do is try to run things on autopilot when you can, when it makes sense. And so that's where your substitutes help you. And then you also want to make sure that you're not running into neutralizers that are compromising the effectiveness of your leadership. And so that is the value of the model, essentially. The next couple of slides go through each and every one of the situations in which leadership practices can be substituted for or neutralized. So since there's a lot here, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of these other than to briefly define and talk about them. So here we go. On the topic of follower characteristics, SLM has something to say about how leadership gets substituted for and neutralized. So, experience and training. If your followers are experienced and well-trained in the tasks that they are completing, then this reduces, of course, the need for leader structuring, which is exactly what I was just mentioning, the training piece and the road mapping and that kind of thing. Point number 2. If followers are professional and just good at what they do, competent, then you need less or no consideration and structuring behaviors from the leader. Okay, I think that one's fairly obvious. And the last one is that any leadership action, whether it's consideration or structuring, is going to be neutralized when your followers do not value the goals of the organization. Okay, so you can talk and ask them to do X, Y, and Z, and they won't do X, Y, and Z, or they'll do it half-heartedly or just compliantly enough, but they won't do a good job because the leadership is neutralized by a lack of valuing the organization's culture and goals, typically. The next part is task characteristics and how they either substitute for or neutralize leadership behaviors. So we'll start with the unambiguous tasks. If you have tasks that are very clear, subordinates know exactly what to do, then you don't really need a leader to structure the task because it's already structured for them. So unambiguous tasks then become a substitute for leader structuring behaviors. Second bullet point, if the task itself provides direct feedback. So in other words, there's something that the task is telling the subordinate as the subordinate is completing the task. So, a lot of computer programs will do this. Anything really mediated by a computer these days will tend to provide a lot of direct feedback. There might be other ways in which the task actually tells the subordinate, hey, you're doing a good job, or hey, you're doing this wrong, try to improve upon this. So there's some evaluative aspect in the feedback from the task itself, that means that the leader doesn't have to provide as much structure or as much consideration as would otherwise be the case, because the task is effectively acting like a leader itself. Now, this is a tricky one because depending on the nature of the feedback, you may need to have some structuring or some consideration that will not be compensated for by the actual direct feedback that the subordinate is getting. So, you actually have to look at it and say, okay, is there some consideration, i.e. emotional support going on in the feedback, which I think is harder to do than direct feedback saying you did a good job, you did a bad job, here's the score on your test or assessment or whatever. And so structuring, I think, tends to be a little bit easier to substitute for than consideration when we're talking about feedback. But it really depends, again, on the mechanism and how automatic it is. The last one, challenging tasks are a substitute for leader consideration. Well, that's not always true. There's a little bit of a caveat on this one. If, again, the subordinate wants challenge and craves challenge, then the leader doesn't have to be considerate necessarily, meaning showing emotional support. Okay, the follower wants to step up to the plate and do something challenging to add to their skills portfolio, so that in and of itself is really all the leadership they need, is being put on the challenging project. Okay, if the subordinate doesn't want challenge and wants something a little easier, doesn't have to apply him or herself that much, then in that particular case, then you still may need consideration. Okay, and you still may need structuring because the employee, there's not a fit there. There's something going on that the employee wants to change, which is downshifting to something less challenging. Again, if they're in a non-challenging job and that's what they want, then really you don't need leadership there because the problem's already solved. The last piece for SLM is organizational characteristics. And again, we're looking for substitutes and neutralizers. So the first is cohesive teams. Cohesive teams are teams where everybody's getting along, everybody understands the goal, they're all aligned towards the goal, and there's minimum of conflict and a lot of friendship happening between members. So if you have that kind of a situation, then that acts as a substitute for leader structuring and consideration. So subordinates are getting emotional support as well as structural support without the leader from their team members, their colleagues, their peers. Bullet point 2, leader's lack of power will neutralize basically everything. If the leader is not powerful enough because he or she doesn't have the right title, the right position, or because he or she has not earned his or her power, then you have a neutralization of both kinds of leadership, structuring and consideration, which I think makes a lot of intuitive sense. You just can't get anything done, so when you try, it just doesn't work. If you have, this is bullet point 3 now, standardization and formalization, so processes, procedures, ways of doing things that are known by everybody. They don't necessarily have to be written down or in diagram form or in a chart. The key differentiator here is whether people know them and know them well, and whether there's conformity in that knowledge across subordinates. So if you have that, that substitutes for the leader providing structure because there already is one. One that seems kind of related to that but is different is the next bullet point, this thing we call organizational rigidity, which is kind of almost a euphemism for our favorite term, bureaucracy. Bureaucracy means layers of administration and decision-making and indirect routes to getting things done in an organization, which is usually just a function of time and size. The bigger the organization gets, the longer it exists. Typically, the more bureaucratic it's going to get. Just look at government, which has been around since the 1776 officially, I guess, and you can know about bureaucracy there. But anyway, when you have rigidity or bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, that's going to neutralize structuring, because what happens is the leader tries to put together his or her own structure for his or her followers to follow, and it is typically at odds or in conflict with the structures set up by the bureaucracy. And so therefore, subordinates don't know what to do, and they will, who knows which direction they'll go in. It depends on the subordinate and the relationship, but the point is there's confusion. and there's a neutralization process going on there. Last but not least, physical distance, which, by the way, still matters in this world of internet collaboration and internet work groups and web stuff. We still have physical distance issues where the farther you are from your followers, the more problems you have with the neutralization of your leadership on both the structuring side and the consideration side. I can tell you about this firsthand. I work with web developers who are local. I work with web developers who are in India, and the work product, all other things equal, is always better when you can deal with somebody close by to you. It's almost always easier to be a leader where you can show up and be in their face and have conversations versus deal with them virtually. Though there are fixes, and we're working on getting more and more, just understanding that whole process of collaborating online. That's something we actually cover in our MSM program. Anyway, physical distance neutralizes structuring and consideration behaviors. And there you have it. So here's a little bit of a wrap-up for you on SLM, and some of this will be just a bit repetitious, but it wouldn't hurt to hear it twice. Remember, again, you've got substitutes, you've got neutralizers. Substitutes tend to be good things for leadership. They bolster leadership effectiveness. Neutralizers, the exact opposite. They compromise it. So the main message is, use these substitutes to help you devote time to other things that are more strategic or higher level. So the examples given here are, to help empower your subordinates and to develop them, okay, which kind of go hand in hand. It's kind of almost the same thing in a way. But also to help you spend time on other issues, networking, strategic planning, where you don't have to be directive and you don't have to step into the game and make things happen so personally. Number 2, technology is one of the biggest substitute creators we have. We talked about how technology can provide its own feedback on the task, and that's just one way in which technology acts as a substitute. There are others that we discussed or touched on. So, look to the technology to help you do that. It's not always going to be a good fix, but a lot of times it is. And you have to understand, the technology you're dealing with and what it can and can't do for you. Autonomous work groups and teams that are self-directed, we'll talk more about that later in the course. They are a substitute for leadership. So, think about delegating the leadership to a team, and then they may still answer to you, but the point is that you are, as a leader, are not spending time managing or leading that team necessarily, other than just picking the team and maybe following up every now and then. And then, of course, on the negative side, be aware of the things that can neutralize your leadership behaviors and try to get them out of the system, so to speak, or at least minimize their damage. Sometimes it's just impossible to neutralize these factors, and if you could, you would, but if you can't, you won't, so that's okay. Just realize there's some things that are beyond your control as far as neutralization goes, and try to figure out a way around that. There are compensating mechanisms usually. The last model we'll look at in this chapter is the Leader-Member Exchange Model, or LMX for short. First of all, my congratulations on wading through all of these models. I know it can get overwhelming as you go through the chapters here and listen to all the different theories and the construction of them. And so congratulations on almost being done, and I'll congratulate you in a few more slides once you've actually finished with Chapter 3 here. But for now, let's talk about LMX. LMX is the research model that's gotten the most attention and the most research follow-up on it. And your book, I believe, states that. For some reason, this model just appeals to a wider variety of practitioners and academics than other models, probably because it creates the least amount of problems in explaining the way leadership happens. That's typically how theories and research models tend to persist and get increased attention. Is they tend to work. If a model is bad, it's going to not get published in the first place. If it's working in some situations and not in others, then typically you'll publish in the areas where it's not working and come up with a fix. And then the third possibility is the model tends to always work, but usually in those situations there's a compromise on how much it can predict, and that's kind of the thing with LMX. It's a great model, but it's very general. Anyway, LMX is about the relationship leaders have with their followers. and it talks about the personal nature of that relationship. So, think about your family relationships, mother to son or daughter, husband, wife. There are others, of course, but it's not so dissimilar to what you have in the workplace in an organization where leaders and followers are mother or father figures or something in between, and it's a kind of a derivative of a family relationship that is, of course, work focused. And so relationships form, friendships form, reporting lines are conducive to relationships, and so this model looks at the kinds of relationships that leaders can have with followers, and bullet point 2 is very telling in that regard. It says leaders don't treat every follower the same way. Now, why that happens is because of, I'll skip down to bullet point 4, there are in-groups and out-groups, and leaders either consciously or unconsciously create, I should say intentionally or unintentionally create in-groups and out-groups with their followers. We talked about in-groups and out-groups in Unit 2. We talked about the Globe and Hofstede dimensions, and we talked about collectivism. Collectivism is a system that very much values the in-group and very much devalues the out-group. And so you could almost say that the LMX kind of behaviors are a collectivist kind of a notion in some way, and they are. So, bullet point 4 is absolutely true. Leaders will have a closer and richer relationship with those who are in their in-group, and they will have not as close or richer relationship with those who are in the out-group. And so therefore, as bullet point 3 says, every follower experiences the leader's leadership in a different way, or as it says there, does not experience leadership in the same way. Same thing. And so, really what it comes down to is which group you're in. Are you in the in-group or are you in the out-group? And depending on where you stand with respect to that issue, that's going to determine what kind of leadership behaviors you're exposed to as a follower. Not much to say here other than this is a neat little diagram that summarizes the in-group, out-group phenomenon. As you can see, the Fs, which stands for follower, that are in the in-group, in white there, are much closer to the leader, have better relationships, whereas the Fs who are in the green area are in the out-group, and they're trying to get into the in-group, some of them, but usually can't. And so they have a worse relationship with the leader, and they don't get as many assignments that they want, and they probably don't get promoted as much, they may not get paid as much. So, just about every aspect of work quality suffers for the followers who are in the leader's out group, as opposed to those who are in the in group get the preferential treatment just because, again, the bond in the relationship is there and stable. So now I don't want you to think that it's so easy to get into an in-group. You're looking at the model, you're saying, okay, well, I'll just be part of my leader's in-group if I'm a follower, and then I'll get preferential treatment, and life will be rosy. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. It's not quite that easy. There is a process by which one gets to enter and remain in the leader's in-group. And so here you have the 3 general stages. You start out with testing and assessment, where the leader will give you some assignments. They'll push your boundaries. They'll see how much heat you can take. I'm sure you've all been in those kinds of situations, especially when you're new to a job. And that's the testing and assessment phase. Then it's followed by a development of trust, where you've kind of passed the testing and assessment phase. We think that you're going to make a pretty good member of the in-group, and so now it's just a matter of developing trust between us. And that leads to the last stage or state, which is you're a full-fledged member of the in-group, and therefore there is an emotional bond between leader and follower. And really, as when we talk about charismatic leadership later on in the course, that's really what it revolves around, is that emotional bond. And sometimes people have a hard time understanding, how can I have an emotional bond with my boss? It happens all the time. And there are just as many good relationships as there are bad ones between bosses and subordinates. And the good ones tend to revolve around positive emotions or persistent experience of positive emotions in whichever way the leader or the boss is skilled in creating and maintaining those in the relationship. Okay, so our very last slide for the unit here is just some advice that springs forth from the LMX model. As you might imagine, the LMX behaviors are good and bad. They are sometimes very effective at getting followers to do what needs to be done, but other times they can lead to dysfunctional behavior in organizations because the leader is essentially abusing their power by giving too many favors. I'm trying to find the right word there. Too many favors and too much positive work quality to the in-group members at the expense of alienating the out-group members. And there are sometimes there's good reasons to do that. If it's a performance-based differentiation, meaning those who are in the in-group are simply performing better in all important respects, then it's probably not a bad idea to be acting that way as a leader. But when it gets abused because the leader just doesn't like people who are not like them or don't support some of their bad ideas, then you see the potential for abuse, where the out-group people are not getting to voice their opinion, they're not getting input on projects, and they're not raising the general level of quality work in the organization because the leader won't let them. So anyway, from this we have some provisos or directives that help us manage the LMX phenomena. One is not to really have a highly differentiated in-group, out-group split. So really everybody should either be in your out-group or everybody should be in your in-group, and probably what's preferential is that everybody's in your in-group. But we know that that's not realistic in a lot of situations. Point 2, keep membership fluid and dynamic. So, one day you're in my in-group, then you're in my out-group, then you're in my in-group again. That kind of thing, where people don't get this notion that if they brown nose or if they just agree wholeheartedly with the leader, even when they're not making any sense, that they'll be part of their in-group. If people don't see that happening or see the opposite happening, then they're gonna assume and they're gonna perceive that there is no in-group out-group split, or that there is one but it's loosely defined, and so therefore they'll be on their toes about providing a quality work product. So keep membership fluid and dynamic, people in, people out, as performance dictates. This is bullet point 3 now, have different in-groups for different activities. So again, if you're going to have in-groups, then have one for project A, another one for project B, where the members are different in each of those in-groups. That's a better strategy than just keeping the same kinds of people in your in-group permanently, or your one in-group permanently. Bullet point 4 I already mentioned. If you're going to have the split, then the split should be based on performance. So in-group members are better performers, out-group members are worse performers. But if you keep the out-group members in your out-group forever, they're never going to improve. So you have to temper that with a focus on trying to improve the performance of your out-group members, which again kind of argues for not really putting anybody in your out-group at all, or at least having that fluid membership. But again, reality being reality, that doesn't always quite happen, and so you have to manage the out-group separation consciously. Review your criteria, periodically. So say, hey, why is it that I'm giving more attention, more preferential assignments and treatment, better pay, etc., to these particular people and not these particular people? So what you're doing there is you're reviewing your criteria for in-group membership to make sure it makes sense, and then somebody else should be looking at it too. Just like they say you shouldn't edit your own writing, well, neither should you be choosing or staying with your own in-group, out-group criteria. You should have those decided by somebody else, and then you implement it. Last one I think is kind of general, but of course important. Consider culture when determining membership. Again, some people will be in your out-group because they don't have the cultural similarities to your in-group folks, and so you may be actually discriminating against them because they are not culturally similar to what you're used to working and what you like to work with. And that we know is a recipe for diversity disaster, when you don't allow people from different cultures and different mindsets into your work environment. and let them flourish there. So that's going to wrap up Chapter 3 on all the different models. Again, I congratulate you on making it through. There's a lot of material here. And so the nice thing about this course is that you don't have to memorize any of this. You have to just understand it and then know when it's useful. And so part of that is just understanding the differences between the models and what one can do for you versus another, and where one is weak and where the other one kind of compensates for it. So you have you've done a great job, hopefully listening, and you've probably picked up a lot of knowledge here, and it's time to move on to week 2. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.